Hi folks, welcome to the Epochs of the Lotus Eaters, where today I am joined by Beau, and we are going to be talking about the Iron Duke, Old Nosy, the Duke of Wellington, Sir Arthur Wellesley, because he has a fascinating life, and he is a fascinating man. And we were talking before we started recording, there are some people who just have a kind of presence about them. They just kind of impose on the scene because of who they are and what they've achieved. And I think that Wellesley is one of these people. I think that there's no getting around the fact that you can see it in the paintings that have been done of him in his lifetime. The man's got the most serious countenance and clearly didn't suffer fools. And to me, that's the sort of best of British, you know. It's like, yes, that's what I want us to produce. So
he would have had a real presence in a room, or people said he did. And there's no two ways about that. The victor of Assaye. He was fantastically famous in his own life. I mean, he became, like the victor of Vermiro, of Talavera, of Waterloo.
Of lots of places.
yeah, he didn't ever lose a big battle. He barely lost an engagement. By the end of his life, in an honorary way, he had like half a dozen field marshal's batons.
Really?
Yeah, people like Prussia or wherever would just make him an honorary field marshal. He was the most famous military man of the early 19th century, easily. And perhaps only Admiral Lord Nelson eclipses him as in out-and-out hero stakes.
Well, that's the thing. They're very different characters, aren't they?
Yeah.
That's the thing. Nelson's a very romantic character, but what I like about Wellesley is he's not romantic. He's very practical, very serious, and he gets the job done. Not that Nelson doesn't. It's the two different approaches to achieve the same goal, really, isn't it?
One of the things I want to say straight away is that I think I've said this a couple of times here or there. I said it for the Eleanor of Aquitaine one about the Lion in Winter, is that sometimes you get an impression of a historical figure from childhood, and in fact it's not accurate, and it takes a long time, if ever, if you just dispel that impression of them. Well, for me, and perhaps for a lot of people our age, in Blackadder III, Stephen Fry, you see Stephen Fry play Wellington in the last episode. Do you remember that at all?
Not offhand, actually. I'm surprised I don't.
Anyway, he has a small cannon duel, absurdly, a duel with very small cannons.
Oh, yeah, no, I do.
At the very end.
Yeah.
And anyway, Fryer plays Wellesley as like this bellowing bully type guy. He's just kicking people and just being an absolute tyrannical bully. And he wasn't like that.
No.
He was very harsh on some of his staff and his men, but he was a gentleman. He wouldn't just scream in someone's face and things like that.
So I think maybe there are different words to use. Exacting might be.
Yeah, very exacting. Yeah. And a thankless master as well.
Yeah, like a man with incredibly high standards, upon whose shoulders rested 50,000 lives, right? So you can understand there's a good reason to have these exacting standards and to expect everyone to have done their very best at all times. And I don't see this as being a mark of poor character or anything like that. If anything, I see it as the opposite. I see it as a mark of high character and something that ennobles the people that would have been around him, even though, as you said, he probably would have been very stringent on these things.
Yeah. All I mean is that, like I say, in Blackadder III, Fryer plays him as like a red-faced, but kicking someone up the arse and shouting at them at a drop of a hat. He wasn't like, he'd be much more likely to just, he was very, perhaps pompous is the right word. He was certainly, what's the word, when you just look down your nose at most people?
Condescending?
Yeah.
Superior?
Yeah. So most people would just sort of, just raise an eyebrow of disdain.
Yeah.
Rather than shout at you.
Yeah. But
then sometimes he did, though. Sometimes
I'm
he
sure
did.
He did. I mean, I'm sure they had reason to.
Yeah.
I'd probably been shouting a lot more than he did if I was in the middle of Waterloo and someone hadn't sent a message to the 5th Division to move up or something. I'd be screaming. Like, so, this though just speaks to a kind of comedy that has lost its place in history, though. Like, and it starts with sort of Monty Python and John Cleese. Where it's like, oh, look at me teasing all you stuffy old conservatives, and the world that they relied upon for the comedy doesn't exist anymore. And so, actually, we would kind of like it if we had a few of the stuffy superior types who were ultimately responsible for everything they did and looked down upon people who were being frivolous. So you had the space to be frivolous. They provided the borders, and this is the sort of, just as a quick tangent, the Stephen Fry style mockery of the British in the 19th and 20th centuries, that's become very passé to me. Like, no, look where we are without them. I would actually like all of those people back, please.
Yeah. Also, the writers of Blackadder are sort of fairly hardline lefties.
Well, yeah.
So they love poking fun at our history. But I love Blackadder anyway. So
so do I. But the point being, this has all fallen in. It's from another era because those people no longer exist.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So another quick couple of notes to say about just in general about the character of Arthur Wellesley. Or a quick thing to say about his name, whether it's Wellesley or Wellesley.
Yeah.
It can be both. So originally his family was Wesley.
Right.
And then they changed it to Wellesley. And then in his own lifetime, he changed it to Wellesley.
Why?
A few different reasons. Well, by the time he was ennobled, he became Wellington.
Yeah.
And his brother, his family were the Earls of Mornington. So, the spelling was not standardised even in the early 19th century. You could play fast and loose with spelling if you wanted to.
No, that's a good point.
It's only really quite modern where it's like, no, that's the one way you spell something, and anything else is just incorrect. It wasn't like that necessarily.
No, that's a great point. I didn't even think about it.
But yeah, so on his character, he was, as you say, sort of exacting, and so he would sort of just look down his nose at the normal men. And on his sort of middling to senior officer corps, he was very harsh and would sometimes actually bellow at them, but very rarely. He was certainly very harsh on them. But for his generals, he would never, ever berate them at all. If they did something really bad, he would just sort of maybe very, very mildly mention it whilst in mess. Yeah, and never remove them from command, or almost never, not never, but almost never.
But this has got the air of your parents saying, "I'm not angry, I'm disappointed."
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, that's even worse.
Plus, at least in the Peninsula War, he didn't have the power to remove generals. He'd have to send a letter to Horse Guards, and they'd have to formally do it. Right. Whereas with his captains and his colonels and his majors and things, he could move them around and replace them and things. So he's sometimes extremely harsh on them. But yeah, I've got a couple of quick notes just in general about him before we sort of start on his actual life.
Okay.
Who's this guy who wrote this? Charles Esdale wrote an interesting introduction to the dispatches of the Duke of Wellington. So the Duke of Wellington didn't write an autobiography or keep a diary as such.
He was a bit busy, I suppose.
Yeah. But what he did do is write lots and lots of actual letters and military dispatches. And then they were nearly all saved. And there's thousands and thousands of them. Even a book that thick is only a tiny number of them.
Were they published in newspapers or anything like that?
Not at the time, but afterwards. No? Right. Yeah, so they were kept within the family.
Right.
And then like the second Duke or the third Duke, because the Duke of Wellington's family is still going now. But his son or grandson sort of published them all in the late 19th century, I believe. And anyway, they're sort of almost better than a diary.
I bet.
Because quite often it's a day-to-day thing, and you get a really good impression of the person. Also, at least after Waterloo, he was so unbelievably famous that anyone that came into contact with him sort of wrote about it or remembered it, and in their memoirs. So there's actually, even though he didn't keep a diary, loads of material on him. And one of the things Sir Charles Oman talks about, next episode, I'm going to read a few pages long quote from Oman about his character when at the beginning of the Peninsula, when he was about 40 years old. And that will go into great detail about the contradictions. He was both sort of a perfect soldier, a perfect servant to the crown in some ways, but in other ways, unbelievably cold, and he was pretty horrible to his wife, and all sorts of things. But what Charles Oman says, writing at the very beginning of the 20th century, the very, very end of the 19th century, he says that until that point, no one ever criticised him, basically. It was just not done if you wrote a history of him or a biography of him. You just omitted the defaults of his character because he was so famous. He was such a hero. It's like, writing something about Nelson and saying, actually, he was a bit of a dick. You just don't do it. You just don't do that. Yeah. And that's not the case. Everyone loved Nelson. But the thing with Wellesley is that you just... it took almost 100 years, or 50 years anyway, from his death, to before anyone would sort of start being completely honest about him.
That does go to show the amount of presence that the man contained, though, right? If you've got a kind of charisma that can make people want to not say bad things about you after your death for 50 or 100 years, then you must have been a very impressive person, whatever your defects.
Speaks volumes. I mean, he was sort of course, there's a lot more to Napoleon Bonaparte's story, but in a way, you can sort of argue that it was Wellington that beat him. The Peninsular War, along with the Russian campaigns, broke Napoleon's back, and then it was Wellington at Waterloo that finally defeated him. So, and quite often in wars, it's the ending that people remember most.
Yeah.
So it's like, he saved us from the Corsican monster. He saved us from the little French tyrant.
Well, in a way, I don't see how that's wrong.
He saved Europe. He saved the world.
That's not necessarily wrong, though.
But yeah, right. Yeah.
If they'd lost at Waterloo, it's entirely possible that Napoleon could have recovered his strength.
Maybe. Who knows how it would have gone? Yeah, who knows?
He had 100,000, Frenchmen at his back. Napoleon can do a lot with that. So, who knows?
Yeah, who knows?
It's entirely possible that, they did save Europe. So,
one thing I mentioned to you before, and I think we was talking completely differently. It was a completely different subject. I think maybe it was something with Stelios about the Roman Empire. And we were talking about there's sort of a couple of ways you can be a commander-in-chief in the field. One, you can sort of delegate things, nearly everything, to your generals or your sort of senior colonels and say, look, this is our general plan. Go get it done. I have full faith in you. Or you can micromanage every single thing they do and don't allow them to really think for themselves ever. There's two ends of the spectrum there. So Wellington was right at that end of the spectrum, like a really, really extreme example of that. Say, no, don't do anything without my orders. Right. And he micromanaged everything. So I've got a couple of quotes here. Arthur said this himself. This is him speaking. Nobody in the British Army ever reads a regulation or an order as if it were to be a guide to his conduct, or in any other manner than an amusing novel. And the consequences is that when complicated arrangements are to be carried into execution, every gentleman proceeds according to his fancy.
That must have been frustrating for him.
The thing was, that's an exaggeration.
Yeah.
But that's how he felt.
Yeah. You can tell he's like, no, I gave you specific and clear instructions to go to this hill and do whatever, and you didn't because you felt like you didn't want to.
Yeah.
You can feel the frustration coming through that little passage there.
Like, do you think you know better than me? Yeah. But it was taken to sort of extreme lengths. So there's one example in, again, the Peninsular War by Charles Oman, where someone really senior, Arthur Wellesley, was sitting down for a portrait by Goya, and one of his senior, it was someone, I don't think he was a general, but one of his senior colonels came in, and he had to take his initiative and retreat his men from one town to another to prevent being cut off. A few thousand guys being cut off. It was absolutely the correct thing to do. 100% the correct thing to do. And it's one of the very few examples where Wellington went mad at him, shouted at him, said, "Who controls the army, you or me?" And the guy was like, but
I just saved a few thousand guys.
Yeah. And a few weeks or even a few months later, at a dinner party or something, the same colonel came up to Wellington. I'll just call him Wellington, even though he went until much later.
Sure.
And said, "Do you remember when you chewed me out the other day for something that was obviously the correct thing to do?" And Wellington was like, "Yeah, all right, it was the right thing to do, but it was just luck that it turned out to be the right thing to do. Don't ever do anything like that again."
Thanks, Arthur.
So I've heard him described more than once as a thankless master, and that is exactly what it is.
Sounds about right, yeah.
And he didn't really have any close friends, particularly. One of the closest guys, Crawford, General Crawford, who fell at Waterloo in the end, all during the Peninsula, every now and again would attempt to be familiar with Arthur, and it was always just snubbed and cold shoulder. So he was a cold fish. Esdale goes on to say this. To contempt for many of his officers was added contempt for all of his men. As is well known, Wellington was devoted to the noose, the lash, and the punishment parade, scornful of notions of democracy and political progress, obsessed with the concept of order, and inclined to regard the mob, and by extension his soldiers, with a mixture of fear, despite, and loathing. Something that is all too typical here, being his description of the raw material of his British troops as the scum of the earth. Whilst the remark may well have been qualified by the admission that service in the army had in the end made them, quote, fine fellows, nothing can hide the prejudice in respect of the lower classes that it reveals. Under Wellington, indeed, few members of the rank and file could expect much in the way of reward. Recommending deserving sergeants for a commission was not unknown to him. In fact, he did so on a number of occasions when he wished to grant a mark of favour to regiments that had particularly distinguished themselves in one battle or another. But he did not like the idea and was famously inclined to caution against it on the grounds that the men concerned were unable to fit in with society in which they found themselves and ended up ruining themselves by turning to drink. One can perhaps go too far here. Wellington could recommend men for promotion, but could not actually commission men himself. Again, he'd have to send back to Horse Guards for that. As he complained, "I, who command the largest British army that has been employed against the enemy for many years, and who have upon my hands certainly the most extensive and difficult concern that was ever imposed on any British officer, have not the power of making even a corporal."
That is strange, though, isn't it?
It is a bit.
You'd think he would have the power to do that.
Yeah, well, he sort of does. He just has to formally do it.
Right.
He has to send back to
but you think
army headquarters in London, Horse Guards.
he should be able to do it by fiat on the battlefield because
Yeah.
he is the commanding officer, the commanding general. But that quote is it's always taken out of context, and it's always only given half. Our men are the mere scum of the earth, and then obviously Wellesley hates the men. Yeah, he does, obviously. I mean, but the other half of what fine fellows we shall make of them is always left off.
It was mentioned there, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was mentioned there, obviously, but in other contexts,
quite often people deliberately leave that bit out.
And it's like, look, he's not saying there's no path to nobility or moral, moral standing. But to be honest with you, a lot of the people in the army probably were kind of like the scum of the earth. It often wasn't the gentlemen of England who were joining the First Regiment of Foot or something. Often these were not the greatest of people, and this is one of the things that I think it really characterizes the kind of English view of the world, which is like Cromwellian warts and all sort of thing. There's a definite lack of romance, but it's not necessarily cruel or unfair. And it's even though there's a bit of a bite in the phrase, there's also a bit of sort of sweetness at the end, where it's like it's not the worst, and there's something about it that kind of appeals to me. Actually, I don't know why.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.